Everything around us is simply waves, like the electron traveling through the two slits in the example to follow. Waves are everywhere, and fill up most of the space around us. These waves continually remain this way, until we decide to observe them. When we observe the waves, they turn into matter, similar to the waves which turn into an electron, only when observed. Until we observe reality as we know it, it does not actually exist in any particular form. The act of observing causes objects to come into existence, otherwise they do not exist, relative to the observer. The thing to note here is that ultimately the object does exist, in a sort of superficial way, similar to the electron which does exist, but it is in a different form. It is a wave, depending on what instrument we use to observe, whether it is an eye, ear, nose or some electronic piece of equipment. These waves change into matter such as houses, cars, music, etc. This is the most important point, so I will repeat it. Everything around us exists in the form of waves. Only when we observe using our sensors, that is eyes, ears, nose, etc., only then matter or objects, things comes into existence. The act of observing creates the world around us, and is created relative to us. Here is the scientific proof. In recent years, scientists have been baffled by the so-called double-slit experiment, which shows that particles of matter, the same stuff everyone and the everything is made from, behave differently depending on whether or not someone is observing them. The idea of the experiment is first to place a sheet of metal parallel to a wall. The sheet of metal has one slit of rectangular shape, cut out from within it. Using a marble firing gun, marbles are fired at this sheet of metal. Some marbles naturally go through the slit in the sheet of metal and hit the back wall. On the back wall is produced a pattern of the slit, where the marbles pass through the slit, and hit the back wall. Then a second parallel slit exactly the same as the first one, is added to the sheet of metal, and the marbles are fired through both slits, and as a result you see a second band of pattern produced on the back wall. All is as it should be so far. Now the same experiment is reproduced, first using one slit then two slits, but instead of marbles, a water wave is allowed to flow through the slits. Thus, in this case the sheet of metal is placed vertically in a bath of water and waves were created. In the case of the metal sheet that had one slit cut within it, the wave hits the middle of the back wall with most intensity directly, in line with the slit. This occurs naturally. As water flows through the slit, it spreads on the other side, with the most water hitting the center of the back wall. This is similar to the line pattern that the marble test created. When the second slit is added to the sheet of metal, something slightly different happens. If the top of one wave hits the bottom of another wave, then they cancel each other out. This creates an interference pattern on the back wall. Basically, the wave hits the back wall at many places. Now, when marbles are fired through the two slits, we see two bands of hits on the back wall. And with waves we get an interference pattern or many bands or points on the back wall. So far this is normal, well understood science. Now we go quantum, to the atom world, which is not visible by the naked eye. The experiment is now rerun, but this time using an electron. An electron is tiny bit of matter or stuff from which things are made, like marbles. In other words, it's a very small portion of the marble, which one could not see with the naked eye. When the electron is fired through one slit, it produces a single band on the back wall just like the marble did. However, When the electron is fired through two slits, it produces many bands like it did for the water case. The expectation was of course that two bands on the back wall should have been produced, and not a wave, as only one electron was fired through at a time, and like the water there was no way an interference could occur. The water created an interference pattern, because it was waves that passed through the two slits, and they collide and create an interference pattern. This implies that the electron leaves the gun as a single particle, and on its travels becomes a wave, similar to splitting in two, then goes through both slits interfering with itself, and producing many bands on the back wall. This baffled scientists, so they decided to look closely, using measuring instruments, at the electron to see which slit it actually goes through, and where in the travels of the electron does the electron become a wave. But then most bizarre thing happened, as when the scientists observed the electron, it did not change to a wave but remained as a particle. The electron went through one slit, or the other, to produce only two bands on the back wall, and not the wave pattern. The electron decided to act differently depending on whether or not it was being watched. As though it was aware that it was being watched, the observer collapsed the wave function simply by observing. Just as in science there is nothing to believe but all ideas can be reproduced by experiment and the results observed by the experimenter, you should experiment and see the ideas for yourself, and do not believe anything that you have not seen for yourself. Although performing the double-slit experiment at home would be very difficult and expensive, you could research and see the results published by scientists around the world who have carried out this experiment. This implies that matter doesn't actually exist as we know it, unless or until it is validated or agreed by an observer that is you. This, as I am sure you will agree, is a mysterious concept, and one more aligned with the religious, philosophical aspect of consciousness as described earlier, rather than the concrete origins of the scientific aspect of consciousness. In order to be notified of my next video, remember to hit the subscribe button and turn on notifications.